Picture this. You're a Japanese Zero pilot over the Philippines, 1944. You've been told you're flying the most maneuverable fighter in the world. Every dogfight you've trained for emphasizes agility, tight turns, and speed. Your Zero can outmaneuver anything the Americans have thrown at you so far. You've danced circles around the clumsy P-47s, and even the newer Hellcats respect your turning radius. Then you spot it, a massive shape climbing toward you, bigger than any single-engine fighter you've ever seen. It's not trying to turn with you. It's not even trying to evade. Instead, it's coming straight at you, nose on, growing larger by the second. And then, before you can react, the entire front of that aircraft erupts in a wall of fire. 8 streams of tracer fire converge on your position. The sound is like tearing fabric, but amplified 1,000 times. Your Zero's thin aluminum skin offers no resistance. The rounds punch through your engine, cowling, your cockpit, your wings. In less than 2 seconds, your aircraft is shredded. Fuel lines rupture. Control surfaces separate. The machine that was supposed to keep you alive disintegrates around you. That was the moment Japanese pilots realized the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just another American fighter. It was a flying gun platform that could literally saw enemy aircraft in half with concentrated firepower. And the terrifying part? There was no counter to it. No amount of maneuverability could dodge that volume of fire once you were in the crosshairs. The Zero had been Japan's pride since Pearl Harbor. Lightweight, fast, and capable of turning on a dime, it dominated the early years of the Pacific War. American pilots learned quickly that trying to dogfight a Zero was suicide. The Japanese fighter could turn inside anything the Allies had, and its experienced pilots used that advantage ruthlessly. But the Zero's strengths came with a fatal weakness. To achieve its incredible agility, Mitsubishi engineers stripped away everything they could. No armor plating protected the pilot. No self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. The airframe itself was built from thin aluminum to save weight. Against poorly armed Chinese aircraft or during hit-and-run attacks on shipping, these compromises didn't matter. But against a fighter armed like the Thunderbolt, the Zero became a death trap. One solid burst from those 850s, and the entire aircraft could come apart. Japanese pilots knew this vulnerability, but their doctrine didn't account for an enemy that could simply overpower them with raw firepower. By late 1943, when P-47 seconds started arriving in the Pacific in significant numbers, the myth of Zero invincibility was already cracking. The Hellcat had proven that American pilots could win by using dive and zoom tactics, refusing to dogfight on Japanese terms. But the Thunderbolt took it further. It wasn't just avoiding the Zero's strengths, it was imposing its own game entirely. The P-47's armament was staggering. 8 Browning M2, 50 caliber machine guns, 4 mounted in each wing. Each gun could fire approximately 800 rounds per minute. Do the math. That's roughly 6,400 rounds per minute combined, or over 100 rounds per second. Each 50 caliber bullet weighed nearly 2 ounces and travelled at over 2,800 feet per second. When all 8 guns converged on a single target, the kinetic energy was devastating. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Republic Aviation's engineers didn't just mount these guns randomly. They positioned them so that their fire patterns converged at a specific distance, usually around 300 yards. This created a cone of destruction where every bullet stream intersected. If an enemy aircraft flew into that convergence zone, it was hit by multiple rounds simultaneously. For lightly built fighters like the Zero, this was catastrophic. But firepower alone wasn't enough. The P-47 needed to get those guns on target, and that meant surviving long enough to take the shot. This is where the Thunderbolt's other qualities became essential. Unlike the Zero, which sacrificed protection for performance, the Thunderbolt was built like a tank. The pilot sat in a cockpit surrounded by armor plating. Critical components like the engine and fuel tanks had additional protection. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine could absorb punishment and keep running. This toughness gave P-47 pilots confidence to press attacks that would have been suicidal in other aircraft. They could fly straight through enemy fire, take hits that would down a Zero, and still deliver their devastating 8-gun salvo. Japanese pilots quickly learned that damaging a Thunderbolt wasn't enough. You had to completely destroy it, and their 20mm cannons and 7.7mm machine guns often lacked the punch to do that before the Jugs 50s tore them apart. The weight difference told the story. A fully loaded Zero weighed around 6,000 pounds. The P-47 tipped the scales at over 17,000 pounds when combat ready. That's nearly 3 times heavier. American engineers took that weight and turned it into advantages: speed in a dive, the ability to absorb damage, and most importantly, the capacity to carry 8 heavy machine guns with hundreds of rounds each. Training manuals from 1944 taught P-47 pilots to leverage their strengths ruthlessly. Never turn with a Zero. Use speed and altitude. Dive in, fire a burst, and zoom back up before the enemy could react. The Thunderbolt's superior high-altitude performance meant it could dictate engagement terms. Japanese pilots found themselves constantly looking up, watching American fighters position themselves for attacks they couldn't prevent. What made the 8-gun armament truly revolutionary was its psychological impact. Imagine being a Japanese pilot who survived an encounter with a Thunderbolt. You watched your wingman's aircraft simply disintegrate under that hurricane of fire. You felt rounds punching through your own plane, felt the controls go mushy as hydraulic lines were cut. If you made it back to base, you had to climb into that same fragile Zero again, knowing that any moment you could face another Jug. Combat reports from both sides reveal the pattern. American pilots described Japanese fighters coming apart or exploding when hit by concentrated .50 caliber fire. Japanese after-action reports mentioned the overwhelming firepower and impossible to evade attacks from Thunderbolts. By 1944, experienced Zero pilots who had survived since Pearl Harbor were being shot down by rookie P-47 pilots simply because the American aircraft's firepower compensated for any skill gap. The numbers bear this out. In Europe, P-47 seconds had already proven their worth, shooting down thousands of Luftwaffe aircraft. But in the Pacific, where Japanese fighters were even more lightly built, the kill ratios were staggering. By 1945, P-47 squadrons were regularly achieving 1-0-1 or better exchange rates. For every Thunderbolt lost, 10 or more Japanese aircraft were destroyed. That's not just good piloting, that's systemic technological superiority. Republic Aviation had stumbled onto something profound. By maximizing firepower and accepting the weight penalty, they created a fighter that rendered enemy advantages irrelevant. The Zero could turn better. Didn't matter when 850s could delete it in 2 seconds. Japanese fighters were faster at low altitude. Didn't matter when the Jug attacked from above and escaped before they could respond. The Thunderbolt's 8.50 caliber machine guns weren't just weapons. They were a philosophy. American military doctrine had always favored firepower, but the P-47 took it to an extreme. Where other nations built fighters around dogfighting prowess, America built one around the ability to destroy anything it could point at. And in the skies over the Pacific, that philosophy won. The first large-scale confrontation between P-47 seconds and Japanese fighters came in early 1944 over the Marshall Islands. American forces were island-hopping across the Pacific, and each new invasion required air superiority. The Japanese knew this. They sent everything they could muster to contest the skies over Kwajalein and Eniwetok. Zeros, Oscars, and even some of the newer Tojo scrambled to meet the American fighters. The 318th Fighter Group, flying P-47Ds from captured airfields, met them head-on. What happened next was less a dogfight than a massacre. American pilots, many on their first combat missions, found that simply pointing their Thunderbolts at the enemy and pulling the trigger was enough. The weight of fire was so overwhelming that snap shots, deflection shots, and even poorly aimed bursts were tearing Japanese aircraft apart. One pilot, Lieutenant Robert De Haven, described his first kill. "I saw a Zero making a climbing turn. I pulled lead, maybe 3 lengths, and squeezed the trigger for maybe 1 second. The Zero just came apart. I mean, the whole tail section separated, and the rest tumbled out of the sky. I couldn't believe how fragile it was." That fragility became the defining characteristic of Japanese aircraft when facing 50 caliber fire. The M2 Browning was designed as an anti-materiel weapon, capable of destroying light vehicles and punching through armor plate. When that same weapon was turned against aircraft with no armor at all, the results were predictable. Wings sheared off, fuselages split open, engines seized as rounds punched through cylinder banks. Fuel fires erupted instantly from ruptured, unprotected tanks. Japanese pilots tried everything to counter the Thunderbolts. Some attempted head-on passes, hoping their own 20mm cannons would do enough damage before the Americans could fire. This rarely worked. The P-47's armored windscreen and engine absorbed the hits, while the Zero pilot faced 8 streams of 50 caliber fire with nothing but thin aluminum between him and oblivion. Other pilots tried to use their superior maneuverability, attempting to force the Thunderbolts into turning fights. But P-47 pilots had been drilled on one rule: never turn with the enemy. Maintain speed, maintain altitude, and only engage on your terms. The tactics manual was explicit. The P-47's advantages are firepower, speed, and diving ability. Use them. Dive on the enemy from altitude, fire a 2 to 3 second burst, and climb away. If you miss, regain altitude and repeat. Never attempt to dogfight enemy fighters. Your aircraft is faster and more heavily armed. That is enough. This doctrine worked brutally well. Over the Philippines in late 1944, P-47 squadrons of the 5th Air Force flew escort missions for bombers and ground attack sorties. Japanese interceptors rose to meet them, and every encounter followed the same pattern. Thunderbolts would spot enemy fighters below them, roll into a dive, accelerate past 400 miles per hour, and open fire at around 300 yards. By the time the Japanese pilots realized they were under attack, it was too late. The statistics from the Philippines campaign tell the story. Between October 1944 and March 1945, P-47 units in theater claimed over 1,200 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air, with fewer than 60 Thunderbolts lost to enemy fighters. That's a kill ratio of 2-0 to 1. Some squadrons did even better. The 460th Fighter Squadron, flying from Mindoro, reported 214 confirmed kills against just 4 losses. These weren't exaggerations or propaganda. Ground crews could verify victories by counting bullet holes in returning Thunderbolts and matching them against gun camera footage. What made these engagements particularly one-sided was the lethality of the 50 caliber round against Japanese aircraft structures. American ordnance engineers had developed several types of ammunition specifically for air combat: standard ball rounds for general shooting, armor-piercing incendiary rounds to penetrate and ignite, and tracer rounds to help pilots aim. P-47 seconds typically loaded a mix of all three. The result was that every burst included rounds designed to punch through metal, rounds designed to start fires, and rounds that let the pilot see exactly where his fire was going. Japanese aircraft, built without armor or self-sealing tanks, were uniquely vulnerable to this combination. A single armor-piercing incendiary round hitting a fuel tank could ignite the entire aircraft in seconds. Tracers that struck the cockpit area killed pilots instantly. Even the ball rounds, traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second, could tear through wing spars and control surfaces, rendering aircraft uncontrollable. Combat film from gun cameras captured the horror in stark black and white. Frame by frame, you can see Japanese fighters entering the crosshairs, then disintegrating as the 50 caliber rounds hit. A Zero's wing folds upward, then separates completely. A Tojo's engine explodes in a cloud of smoke and debris. An Oscar enters a flat spin as its tail is shot away. These weren't dramatic Hollywood explosions. They were cold, mechanical destructions, metal meeting metal at high velocity, and the lighter, less protected aircraft losing every time. Japanese commanders recognized the problem but had no solution. Building heavier fighters meant sacrificing the maneuverability that had defined their doctrine. Adding armor and self-sealing tanks would make their aircraft too heavy for the underpowered engines they had available. Japan's industrial base simply couldn't produce the 2,000 horsepower engines that made the P-47 possible. They were trapped by their own earlier design choices. By mid-1945, Japanese fighter pilots were being sent into combat with minimal training, often with less than 100 hours of flight time. They faced American pilots flying aircraft that could absorb damage and deliver overwhelming firepower. The imbalance was so severe that Japanese commanders stopped expecting their fighters to win air superiority. Instead, they husbanded them for kamikaze escorts, hoping that suicide attacks might accomplish what conventional combat could not. The psychological toll was immense. Surviving Japanese pilots described the sound of 50 caliber rounds hitting their aircraft as like being inside a drum during a hailstorm. The stress of knowing that any encounter with a Thunderbolt could be instantly fatal shattered morale. Some pilots froze in combat, unable to react. Others broke formation and fled at the first sight of P-47 seconds. A few refused to fly altogether, preferring court-martial to certain death. American pilots noticed the change. Where early in the war, Japanese fighters had been aggressive and willing to press attacks, by 1945 they often tried to avoid combat entirely. One P-47 pilot over Okinawa reported, "We'd spot a group of enemy fighters, and they'd immediately dive for the deck and run. They wanted no part of us. Can't say I blame them. We were shooting down everything that flew." The butcher's bill wasn't just measured in destroyed aircraft, it was measured in lost expertise. Every experienced Japanese pilot shot down by a Thunderbolt represented years of training that couldn't be replaced. By contrast, American pilot training pipelines were producing thousands of new aviators every month, each trained on tactics proven to work against Japanese fighters. The experience gap, which had favored Japan in 1941, had completely reversed by 1945. Ground crews played their part too. They kept those 50 calibers firing reliably, cleaning and maintaining guns that fired thousands of rounds per mission. They loaded ammunition belts with precision, ensuring the right mix of round types. They patched bullet holes and replaced damaged components, keeping Thunderbolts flying even after taking hits that would have downed lesser aircraft. The entire system, from pilot to mechanic to aircraft design, was optimized for one thing: delivering overwhelming firepower at the critical moment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. The effectiveness of the 8-gun armament also influenced post-war fighter design. While jets were on the horizon, the lesson was clear: firepower matters. The F-86 Sabre, America's first swept-wing jet fighter, carried 6 50 caliber machine guns. The F-84 Thunderjet, the P-47's jet-powered successor, had the same 8-gun armament. It took until the missile age before designers felt confident reducing gun armament, and even then, Vietnam proved that guns were still necessary. But in the Pacific War's final year, there were no missiles, no guided weapons, just pilots, planes, and guns. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 8 50 caliber Brownings, proved that when firepower is concentrated enough, it overcomes every other advantage an enemy might have. By the time Allied forces prepared for the invasion of Okinawa in April 1945, the myth of the Japanese fighter pilot as an unstoppable warrior had been thoroughly destroyed. The P-47 Thunderbolt, along with other American fighters, had achieved something unprecedented: total air superiority over the entire Pacific theater. But the cost to Japan's air forces went beyond mere numbers. It was existential. The last major air battles of the war happened during Operation Iceberg, the Okinawa campaign. Japanese commanders knew this was the final defensive line before the home islands. They threw everything remaining into the fight: conventional fighters, kamikaze attackers, and even obsolete biplanes loaded with bombs. Against them stood a wall of American fighters, including hundreds of P-47 seconds flying from captured airfields on Iwo Jima and from escort carriers offshore. What happened in those skies was less a battle than an execution. Japanese pilots, many with barely enough training to take off and land, faced American veterans flying aircraft that outclassed them in every meaningful way. The Thunderbolt's 50 caliber guns tore through the massive formations of kamikazes before they could reach the fleet. P-47 pilots described it as target practice. Slow-moving Japanese bombers and suicide planes, already struggling to evade the faster Hellcats and Corsairs, and had no chance against Thunderbolts diving from altitude with all 8 guns blazing. One pilot from the 318th Fighter Group recalled a mission on the 12th of April 1945. We intercepted a formation of about 40 enemy aircraft, mix of VALs, Judys, and Zero escorts. We hit them from above, all 8 guns firing. In less than 5 minutes, we'd shot down 18 of them. They just fell apart. Some tried to maneuver, but they were too slow, too clumsy. It wasn't a fight, it was slaughter. The kill ratios reached absurd levels. Some P-47 pilots became aces in a single mission, shooting down 5 or more enemy aircraft before landing to rearm. The sheer volume of fire made it almost impossible to miss. Even poor shots could score kills because the 8-gun spread covered such a wide area. If any part of that cone of fire intersected with an enemy aircraft, it was effectively destroyed. Japanese military leadership recognized the hopelessness of their situation. Internal documents from late April 1945 acknowledged that air defense of Okinawa had failed completely. One report stated, "Our fighters are unable to contest enemy aircraft. The enemy's firepower is overwhelming. Our pilots, even when they successfully engage, are shot down before they can inflict damage. Losses are unsustainable." But the war continued. Kamikaze attacks, for all their horror, were born from desperation. If Japanese fighters couldn't win air battles, perhaps suicide attacks could at least damage the enemy fleet enough to make invasion too costly. The Dan P-47's role shifted from pure fighter to fleet defense. Squadrons flew combat air patrol over the invasion fleet, vectored to intercept incoming kamikazes by radar operators on ships and land. The effectiveness was brutal. P-47 seconds could spot incoming Japanese aircraft from miles away, climb to intercept, and shred them with 50 caliber fire before they got close to the fleet. Pilots developed a grim efficiency. Identify the bogey, close to within 400 yards, fire a 2-second burst, watch it fall, move to the next target. Some pilots shot down multiple aircraft on single patrols. The 8-gun armament meant they carried enough ammunition for sustained combat, unlike some fighters that burned through their ammunition in seconds. Japanese pilots who survived these encounters described them as flying into a wall of metal, the tracer fire from 8.50 calibers looked like solid streams of light in the gun camera footage. There was no dodging it, no maneuvering through it. If a Thunderbolt got within range and fired, you were already dead. Your aircraft just hadn't finished falling yet. The psychological warfare aspect was deliberate. American commanders wanted Japanese pilots to fear the Thunderbolt. Intelligence officers noted that captured Japanese aircrew specifically mentioned the giant fighter with 8 machine guns as the most feared American aircraft. This wasn't about physical capability alone. It was about breaking the enemy's will to resist. By June 1945, organized Japanese air resistance had essentially ceased. The few remaining fighters were hidden in caves or under camouflage, preserved for a final defense of the home islands that never came. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, followed by Japan's surrender, the air war was already over. The P-47 and its contemporaries had won so decisively that Japan could no longer contest the skies at all. The final accounting is staggering. P-47 Thunderbolts in the Pacific theater shot down over 3,500 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 150 to enemy fighters. That's a kill ratio of approximately 2-3-1. These numbers don't include the thousands of Japanese aircraft destroyed on the ground by Thunderbolt strafing runs, or the countless missions where P-47 seconds protected bombers and ground forces from air attack. The 8.50 caliber guns were the key. They weren't the only reason the P-47 succeeded, but they were the foundation. Every other advantage, speed, ruggedness, high-altitude performance existed to get those guns into position to fire. Once they did, the engagement was over. The concentrated firepower overwhelmed everything Japan could field. For American pilots, the Thunderbolt became legendary. Many preferred it even to lighter, more maneuverable fighters, because they trusted its ability to protect them and deliver overwhelming force. One pilot summed it up: "Give me a P-47 over anything else. I don't care if the enemy can turn tighter or climb faster. When I pull the trigger, they die. That's all that matters in combat." The legacy extended far beyond World War II. The doctrine of overwhelming firepower became central to American military thinking. In Korea, F-84 Thunderjets carried the lineage forward, using .50 calibers to shoot down MiG-15 seconds despite being technically outclassed. In Vietnam, the lack of guns on early F-4 Phantoms proved disastrous, leading to the reintroduction of cannon armament. Every fighter since has incorporated the lesson: you need enough firepower to destroy the enemy in seconds, because that's all the time you may have. The P-47's 8.50 caliber machine guns proved a fundamental truth of air combat. Maneuverability, speed, and pilot skill all matter. But firepower decides fights. When one aircraft can deliver overwhelming destructive force in a brief burst, all other advantages become secondary. The Japanese learned this the hard way, watching their fighters shredded in the skies over the Pacific. Republic Aviation built 15,686 Thunderbolts during the war. Each one carried those 8 Browning M2 machine guns. Together, they fired billions of rounds, turned the tide of countless battles, and established American air superiority so completely that by war's end, Japan had no answer. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air power, became a coffin for its pilots. The Thunderbolt became a legend. In the end, the Japanese never expected 8.50 caliber machine guns to be enough. They thought their agility, their pilot skill, and their warrior spirit would compensate. They were wrong. Firepower won. The Thunderbolt proved it, and the skies over the Pacific became an American domain, written in tracer fire and shredded aluminum, 8 guns at a time. The sun rose over Tokyo Bay on the 2nd of September 1945, illuminating the deck of the USS Missouri, where Japanese officials would sign the instruments of surrender. Overhead, in a carefully choreographed display of American air power, hundreds of aircraft flew in formation. Among them were P-47 Thunderbolts, their 8.50 caliber guns silent now, but their message unmistakable. The skies belonged to those who could control them with overwhelming force. The lessons learned from the Thunderbolt's dominance didn't end with Japan's surrender. They echoed through military planning rooms, aviation engineering firms, and tactical doctrine committees for decades. The question wasn't whether the 8-gun armament had been effective. Combat records settled that beyond dispute. The real question was what it meant for the future of air warfare. American military analysts pored over after-action reports, gun camera footage, and loss statistics throughout late 1945 and into 1946. What they found validated everything the P-47 had demonstrated in combat. Concentrated firepower reduced engagement times, which meant pilots spent less time exposed to enemy fire. The psychological impact of overwhelming firepower degraded enemy morale faster than any other factor. And most importantly, firepower could compensate for pilot inexperience in ways that maneuverability never could. This last point was crucial. By 1945, America was producing pilots faster than any nation in history. Training pipelines churned out thousands of aviators monthly, but they couldn't all be experts. The P-47's 8.50 calibers gave even rookie pilots a fighting chance. Point the aircraft in the right direction, pull the trigger, and the sheer volume of fire did much of the work. Japanese aces with years of experience fell to American pilots on their first combat missions, not because of superior skill, but because of superior firepower. The Soviet Union watched these developments closely, while the Red Air Force had focused on maneuverability and cannon armament in aircraft like the Yak-9. Soviet observers noted the P-47's effectiveness. Post-war Soviet fighters began incorporating heavier armament, though they favored cannons over machine guns due to different doctrinal priorities. Still, the principle remained. More firepower meant shorter engagements and higher kill ratios. Britain drew similar conclusions. The RAF had used a mix of machine guns and cannons throughout the war, with aircraft like the Spitfire carrying 8 303 caliber guns. While effective against early German fighters, these lighter weapons proved inadequate against heavily armoured aircraft. British planners studying the Pacific War noted that American .50 calibers delivered significantly more destructive power. Post-war British jets like the Meteor and later the Hunter incorporated 20mm cannons specifically to achieve that same overwhelming firepower the Thunderbolt had demonstrated. Perhaps most importantly, the P-47's combat record influenced American jet fighter development. When engineers at Republic Aviation designed the F-84 Thunderjet in 1946, they retained the same 8.50 caliber armament. They understood that while jet propulsion would revolutionize speed and altitude performance, the fundamental requirement for concentrated firepower remained unchanged. The F-84 entered service in 1947 and went on to prove its worth in Korea, shooting down enemy MiGs with the same devastating firepower its propeller-driven predecessor had used against Zeros. The Korean War provided a brutal validation of these lessons. When F-84 seconds encountered North Korean fighters in 1950, the engagements followed familiar patterns. American pilots used speed and firepower to dictate combat terms. Chinese MiG-15 seconds, while faster at high altitude, learned to respect the Thunderjet's 8 guns the same way Japanese pilots had learned to fear the Thunderbolt. One kill was all it took to shred enemy aircraft, regardless of their performance advantages. But Korea also revealed the limits of .50 caliber armament. Jet aircraft, flying faster and built more robustly than World War II fighters, could sometimes absorb hits that would have destroyed a Zero. This led to the development of 20mm cannons as standard armament on fighters like the F-86 Sabre, though these carried 6.50 calibers as well. The lesson wasn't that machine guns were obsolete. It was that firepower needed to evolve with aircraft design. Meanwhile, the few surviving Japanese pilots who had faced Thunderbolts in combat tried to make sense of their experience. In post-war interviews, many spoke about the psychological impact of that 8-gun armament. One former Zero pilot, Saburo Sakai, who survived the war despite being wounded multiple times, described it clearly. When a P-47 opened fire, you knew you had perhaps 1 second to react. Usually, that wasn't enough. The firepower was so concentrated that even a glancing burst could cripple your aircraft. We learned to avoid them entirely if possible. That admission cut to the heart of what the Thunderbolt had achieved. It hadn't just destroyed enemy aircraft, it had altered enemy behavior. Japanese pilots actively avoided engagement when they could, preserving themselves and their aircraft rather than risk almost certain death. In military terms, this was deterrence through demonstrated capability. The P-47 didn't need to shoot down every enemy fighter. The threat of those 8 guns was often enough. The aviation museums that later acquired P-47 seconds for preservation made sure to highlight the armament. Visitors would stand beside the massive fighter and count the gun ports in each wing, 4 per side, 8 total. Museum guides explained that each gun could fire 800 rounds per minute, that the combined weight of fire exceeded 100 rounds per second, that convergence patterns created a cone of destruction no enemy aircraft could survive. For younger generations who had never experienced combat, these numbers helped convey the lethality that veterans already knew intimately. Hollywood, in its own way, tried to capture the Thunderbolt's firepower on screen. War films from the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds featured P-47 seconds prominently, always emphasizing the moment when all 8 guns opened fire. Directors used special effects to show wings lighting up with muzzle flashes, tracer fire streaming toward enemy aircraft, and the inevitable destruction that followed. While dramatized, these depictions weren't far from reality. Gun camera footage showed the same visual, 8 streams of fire converging, then an enemy aircraft disintegrating. The engineering community studied the P-47's armament from a technical perspective. How did Republic Aviation manage the heat generated by 8 guns firing simultaneously? The answer lay in robust wing structure and careful placement that allowed airflow to cool the barrels. How did they manage ammunition feed systems that had to work reliably during violent maneuvers? Through meticulous design and testing that ensured each gun received a steady supply of rounds even during high G turns. These technical achievements became teaching points in aerospace engineering programs. Students learned that weapons integration wasn't just about mounting guns on an aircraft. It required understanding thermal dynamics, structural loads, ammunition storage, and systems redundancy. The P-47 represented a masterclass in all of these areas, which is why it remained in service with some air forces into the 1,950 seconds, long after more modern aircraft had entered production. For the families of American pilots who flew Thunderbolts, the 8 50 caliber guns represented something personal, the reason their loved ones came home. Letters from the Pacific Theater often mentioned the confidence those guns inspired. Pilots wrote about feeling protected by their aircraft's firepower, about knowing that if they could just get into position, they would win the engagement. That psychological assurance mattered enormously in combat, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. Conversely, Japanese families mourned sons who never returned, shot down by an enemy whose firepower they couldn't match. Post-war Japan, rebuilding under American occupation, had to reconcile with the technological gap that had contributed to defeat. The P-47's 8 50 calibers became symbolic of that gap, a reminder that industrial capacity and engineering excellence had proven decisive. The final accounting goes beyond statistics, though the numbers remain staggering. In the European and Pacific theaters combined, P-47 Thunderbolts shot down over 7,000 enemy aircraft. They flew more than 1.9 million combat sorties. They delivered over 130,000 tons of bombs and rockets. But most relevant to this story, those 8 50 caliber machine guns fired hundreds of millions of rounds in anger, each one a small piece of the overwhelming firepower that won the war. Today, the few remaining airworthy P-47 seconds are national treasures. When they fly at air shows, crowds gather to watch. The announcer always mentions the armament, 8 50 caliber machine guns. The audience imagines what it must have been like to face that wall of fire, or to control it. Veterans in attendance, now in their 90s if still alive, remember firsthand. For them, there's no imagination required. They lived it. The legacy continues in unexpected ways. Modern fighter aircraft, despite carrying missiles and advanced cannons, still reference the Thunderbolt's philosophy. The A-10 Warthog, designed as a close air support aircraft, carries a 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon that fires 3,900 rounds per minute. That's the P-47's doctrine taken to its logical extreme. Overwhelming firepower delivered accurately. Engineers designing that aircraft studied World War II ground attack missions flown by Thunderbolts and built upon those lessons. In the end, the story of the P-47's 8 50 caliber machine guns is about more than aviation history. It's about the principle that firepower, properly applied, changes the calculus of warfare. The Japanese expected to win through superior pilot skill and aircraft maneuverability. They built their entire air doctrine around those advantages, but when faced with an opponent who simply brought more guns to the fight, those advantages evaporated. The Thunderbolt proved that sometimes the answer isn't elegance or finesse, sometimes it's raw, overwhelming force applied with precision. 8 machine guns, firing in concert, each one capable of tearing apart metal and destroying aircraft. That was enough. That was more than enough. And the skies over the Pacific, once contested by agile Zeros, became American territory, claimed not through maneuverability or speed alone, but through firepower that no enemy could withstand. When the last P-47 fired its guns in anger, when the war ended and the Thunderbolts came home, they had rewritten the rules of air combat. Every fighter designed since has had to answer the question, does it have enough firepower? Because the P-47 proved that, in the end, that's what matters most. Not the aircraft that turns the tightest or flies the fastest, but the one that can destroy the enemy before the enemy destroys you. 8. 50 caliber Browning machine guns. That was the answer in 1945. And in the terrible arithmetic of air combat, it was the right answer. The Japanese never expected it. By the time they understood it, the war was already lost.